I invite you to open up to 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19 this morning, and today is the last day of our Days of Elijah series. We're going to be wrapping it up and landing the plane today in chapter 19, and we're going to begin right there in verse 1. So please read with me. We're told, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life, and he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. So let's pause there, and we'll set up the scene for today's text. What you're going to find out this morning is Elijah is coming to this humble realization that life is sometimes like a roller coaster ride, is it not? Sometimes you're up on top, but then on a roller coaster ride, you can be brought down low very, very quickly. And this is happening to Elijah. Last week, he was up on top. And if you remember, over the course of our study, we've learned about Elijah, how it all was leading to this defining moment at Mount Carmel. In chapter 17, the wicked king Ahab is confronted by God's prophet Elijah. And Elijah comes up to the wicked king who had been leading Israel to do all kinds of wicked things. And he said, it's not going to rain for 3.5 years. He says, it's going to take a while. I'll call down the rain. And he leaves. And God takes him into hiding for 3.5 years. And if you remember in the 18th chapter, Elijah reemerges with Ahab, and they have that altercation. They have that conflict, the fight right there at Mount Carmel, but it's not between these two men, it's between these two men's gods. And Elijah challenges them. He says, meet me at the top of Mount Carmel, bring your 450 prophets of Baal, and I will be the one prophet for Yahweh, and we will build 2 altars, call down fire, and whoever has the fire come down, we know that God is the true God. And we all remember the story. The fire comes down, Yahweh wins, Elijah destroys the 450 prophets. But then last week you saw that, remember, the last thing that had to happen was the rain had to come down, because God's always true to his promises. So the prophet prays that prayer we studied last week. The rain comes down. And you remember how chapter 18 ends? It ends with that sweet victory at Mount Carmel, where God has shown up and shown out. He's done everything that Elijah could have hoped for and dreamed for, that Baal has been destroyed, the prophets have been killed. And if you remember last week, we were told at the end of chapter 18 that Elijah went to Jezreel. He came down from that mountain. And he went to Jezreel, we're told the hand of the Lord was upon Elijah. You remember that. And as he went to Jezreel, he was thinking, this is over. God has won, Baal has lost, good times are here, and he runs ahead of Ahab to make that victorious proclamation as a herald. But then we're told in verse 1 something happened critical. We're told Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. So re-enter into the scene Jezebel. And Jezebel is the wicked wife of Ahab. And she would lead her husband to do all kinds of wicked things. And she wasn't at the top of Mount Carmel with them, but she's down there in the city, and Ahab shows up and tells his wife what happened, and we're told in that moment Elijah is afraid. And why is he afraid? He's got good reason to be afraid. If you remember Jezebel in chapter 18, remember Obadiah. And Obadiah worked for Ahab, but he was hiding prophets. And why was he hiding prophets of God? It's because Jezebel was trying to kill them all. Jezebel hated the Lord. She hated the Lord's prophets. And then suddenly, Elijah is now on her bad side. And she hears this news that her husband could not defeat Elijah. And she says, I will defeat him myself. And she said, I promise he will be dead by tomorrow. Elijah hears this news, and we're told in verse 3, he was afraid, and he ran for his life, and he came to Beersheba. Now, it's worth noting here that every other time in the story up to this point, when Elijah gets up and moves, you know what precedes it? We're told the Lord spoke to Elijah. But here the Lord is not speaking to Elijah to rise up. Instead, we're told he arose up. He got up himself. And where does he go? He goes to Beersheba, which is south of Mount Carmel, about 100 miles. He's literally trying to get as far away as he can. And it's important for us to see and recognize this dichotomy of the scenes between chapter 18 and chapter 19. Because in chapter 18, we're told Elijah is running to Jezreel because the hand of the Lord is upon him. But in chapter 19, he's running to Beersheba because he believes the hand of the Lord cannot protect him. In chapter 18, he's running for God. In chapter 19, he's running from God. And this is Elijah's story, that he was up top and now suddenly and very quickly he's been brought low. And what Elijah's learning in chapter 9 is a lesson that lots of us have already learned. It's simply this: mountaintop experiences don't last forever. Mountaintop experiences do not last forever. Most of our lives are spent in valleys. We get the sweetness of mountaintop experiences, and Elijah had one. He was with the Lord. God moved in a miraculous way. He saw victory for the kingdom of God. But then suddenly he finds himself in a valley shortly thereafter. Have you ever found yourself in a similar valley in your own life? I've seen people that have been on top of the mountain, but then they've been brought low very, very quickly thereafter. I have celebrated at the top of the mountain when I go to a wedding ceremony. And I see a young couple come together and there's celebration, excitement. It is a mountaintop experience, but then I've also worked with some of those couples weeks and months later when they are considering divorce in the valley. I've seen young couples that have celebrated at the mountaintop of a pregnancy, and they rejoice over the new life that has come into that mother's womb, but then I've grieved with those families in the valley where weeks and months later they've had to go through the heartache of a miscarriage. I've seen people up on top of the mountain that have been in good health, the best health of their lives, but then suddenly they get one phone call from their doctors and that changes everything, and they're fighting for their lives. Some people have been on top of the mountain with their finances, and business is good, bank account is full, and then suddenly the economy turns and they go from the mountaintop to the valley, from feast to famine. The same is true in our spiritual lives for each of us. Have you ever had that mountaintop experience with God? For some of you, maybe it was a camp you went to as a kid. Maybe it was a retreat. Maybe it was a conference. Maybe it's worship right now. It's having a moment with the Lord in public worship. But what's going to happen here in a few minutes is we're going to leave this mountain and we're going to go back down to our homes. And some of us will find ourselves in very difficult valleys, filled with temptation, filled with trials, filled with all kinds of hardship. So the question is, what do you do when you reach those valleys? You see, for Elijah, he was not ready for it. He thought that it was over, that it was going to be easy from here on out, and God said, no, I never promised that to you. And sometimes we deceive ourselves as well. We think if we just get our lives right with God, that suddenly everything's going to be easy. But you know what Jesus told us in John chapter 16, verse 33? He said, in this world you will face trouble. But sometimes we face trouble and we're surprised like Elijah. But the truth is, God never promised to any of us that we would stay on the mountaintop forever. But the thing he did promise is that he would walk with us through the valleys. That's why David says famously in Psalm chapter 23, verse 4, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he said, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. He said, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You see, God wants to meet you in the valleys. Unfortunately, sometimes we blame God for the valley and we run away from him. Elijah's having such a moment. He's running away from the Lord because he finds himself in a tough season. But what we're going to see in this passage today is that even when we are unfaithful to God, God is faithful to us. And when we run away from him, he still keeps pursuing us. And he's going to go find Elijah in his darkest moment. Go back to the text in verse 4. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he came and he sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, it is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Can you see how quickly this man has fallen? This man was the hero of the story last week. The same guy that called down fire and rain now says, "I'm so miserable, I just want to die. I just want to die. I'm done." You see, what you see from Elijah is that he's not Superman. Sometimes we make spiritual leaders out to be these heroes. He is an ordinary man, and he struggled, believe it or not, with mental health right here in the passage. You see, sometimes we forget that. We think that people become so spiritual that they actually don't struggle with emotional and mental needs. And here you have Elijah in a dark place, even after he called down the waters. If you go through the scriptures, you see examples of this. You see David, who was a man after God's own heart, as spiritual as anyone. Yet just read through the Psalms and you will see how much despair that man had. You look to Job, and Job, we're told, was a righteous man. Yet he called out to the Lord depressed for many, many chapters. And here you see Elijah writing a page of that same book. He's a man who loves God, that did everything that God had called him to do, but he finds himself in this dark place. What's interesting is if you actually just study history, church, or just national history, you will find that this is common for many of our country's greatest leaders. I'm going to read just a few quotes, and I'm going to tell you who said these things in modern times. This is the first quote. We're told, "Jesus has a very special love for you, but as for me, the silence is so great that I look and I do not see, I listen and I do not hear." Who do you think said that quote? Mother Teresa. She said, "Things have gotten so dark, I don't even know if I can hear from him anymore." Then you go backwards a little further into history, and this is a quote that has been recorded. Someone said, "I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth." Do you know who said that in American history? Abraham Lincoln. Arguably the greatest president, says he's depressed. If you go back a little further into church history, you hear this quote, "I suppose that some brethren neither have much elevation or depression. I could almost wish to share their peaceful life, for I am tossed up and down. And although my joy is greater than most men, my depression of spirit is such as few can have an idea of." Do you know who wrote those words? The great Charles Spurgeon. So you see in these quotes, arguably the greatest preacher to ever live, arguably the greatest president to ever live, and arguably one of the greatest figures of the faith to ever live. They all had the same commonality. What was it? Depression. They found themselves in a dark place. And Elijah's finding himself in a dark place. And sometimes you could read this story and you could say, well, it must just be because he's not praying hard enough. Something went wrong. Perhaps there are some spiritual issues, and actually God's going to diagnose that here in a few minutes. But it's worth noting that Elijah is having a mental breakdown. And sometimes in churches, we don't like talking about this because we think it's somehow taboo, but believe it or not, spiritual people have mental breakdowns. It happens all the time. That they burn themselves out, they struggle with depression, they struggle with anxiety, but what happens unfortunately in religious circles is most religious people don't want to admit it because they think it's all supposed to be butterflies and roses. They think everything's supposed to be great. And if they admit they have a problem and they are the only weak one, and Elijah says, "I'm so weak right now." He says, "I'll admit it. I just wish I wasn't even alive right now." My question is, have you found yourself in a place of darkness? One of our core values here at ABC is authenticity, if you remember. And I applaud Elijah because he's having an authentic moment. He's saying, "I'm miserable right now. And I will admit it to God." And the good news is when you open up and you let light shine into darkness, God always has a pathway for healing. But Elijah's honest. My question is, have you been honest yourself? Go back to verse 5 and let's see what happens. He cries out to the Lord, and we're told, and he laid down and he slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones, and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again, and the angel of the Lord came again a second time, and touched him and said, arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. And he arose and he ate and drank, and went in the strength of the food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God, also known as Mount Sinai, I might add. So here in verse 5, he just gets done pouring out his heart, says, I wish I was dead. He's in a dark place, but God heard that prayer. And you notice what happened was God sent an angel, and the angel started meeting his needs. But what was the first need that had to be met? Did you catch it? What did Elijah first do? He slept. He fell asleep. And then the angel showed up and fed him. And then what did he do after that? He slept again. And then the angel woke him up and he fed him again. You see, sometimes in life, the most holy thing you can do is simply take a nap. Take a nap and get rest and eat some good food. And I laugh, and we laugh about that. But the reality is we don't like that medicine because we think that medicine makes us weak. To say, I actually need rest. Notice that the angel didn't show up to Elijah and start a discipleship study. He didn't take him through 8 weeks of some curriculum. He didn't even immediately pray with him and meet with him. He just said, take a nap and eat and get yourself together. He said, take some time for yourself. And what we're learning here from Elijah in this text is this, that when you neglect self-care, it will lead you to dark places. When you neglect self-care, it will lead you to dark places. Elijah has not been taking care of himself. He's been blowing and going. He's been running 100 miles an hour. He just ran from Ahab for 3.5 years, hiding in the desert. And then he shows up to see Ahab with a whole army of prophets, and he walks in faith and does the things God tells him to do. But he is burned out. He's burned out because he's been running hard for God, and apparently he has not been taking care of himself. And when we fail to take care of ourselves, you know what happens? We start making dumb decisions. That's what happens. When we don't take care of ourselves, we start making dumb decisions. I would dare say many of us in this room have probably been there where we've had a knee-jerk decision in our lives, where we made a bad decision that we regret. And why did we make that decision? It's because we were tired. It's because we were tired and we overreacted. For some of us in this room, we have opened our mouths and said things we never wanted to say that we didn't mean. And why did we say those things? It's because we were burned out. For some in this room, you keep running to the same substances, coping mechanisms. You run back to alcohol, you run to drugs, you run to even pornography, which is a drug, by the way. And why do we keep running back to those coping mechanisms? It's because we're exhausted. It's because we need relief, because we're not taking care of ourselves, so we hope something else will take care of us instead. You see, if you neglect your self-care, what will happen is you will be able to get through this one little moment or season, but if you give it long enough, you will crash and you will burn just like Elijah. So I ask you this question today: are you neglecting your own self-care? Are you getting rest? Are you getting rest? Because somehow in America and Western culture, we've acted like rest is for wimps. It's for wimps. If you want to actually do something, then stay busy all the time. Never put down your phone. Always look important. Neglect church and the Sabbath so you can do other things. And somehow we have put this limelight on busyness as if that makes you important. It may make you important, but eventually it will make you a fool, because you will get tired and you will burn out because you're not superhuman. And neither is Elijah. And Elijah's exhausted. So my question is, how are you taking care of yourself? Do you need a nap? Do you need to start eating right and take care of your body? Do you need to exercise? Do you need to prioritize relationships with other people? Or are you just going? Because I hate to break it to you, you're not the Energizer Bunny. And eventually you will stop. And you'll find yourself in a dark place just like Elijah if you fail to take care of your own needs. God sees that in Elijah. He says, Elijah, we got to first just clean you up, buddy. He says, let's just get you healed up. Let's get you some rest. Let's get you fed. And then we'll start dealing with all those other spiritual issues. And Elijah gets to this place where now he's had his physical needs met and emotional needs there as he's poured out his heart to the Lord. And then God says, meet me at Mount Sinai and we'll talk about it. And he calls him to the same place that he met with Moses. And he calls him to that mountain so that they can have a conversation. And this is what happens. Verse 9, there he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. I love how God starts the conversation. He doesn't start grilling him, he just asks a question, which is what Jesus did so often in his earthly ministry. He just asked questions that would lead to the right answers. And God asked him, he says, what are you doing here, Elijah? Like, why are we here? Why are you out here 100 miles from where you should be? What are we doing? Which maybe even right now, God's asking you that question. What are you doing here? Why is your life in this place right here and right now? Because what he's telling Elijah is, I've got such better plans for you, buddy. What are you doing here? You ran from where I had you. You ran from my purposes for your life. What are you doing here? Do you like where you are right here? And then Elijah answers, and how does he answer? With a pity party. If you caught it, he said, I've been very jealous for the Lord. He starts giving his resume. He says, do you know what I've been doing for you? Let me tell you what I've been doing. And he goes down the list. He says, the people have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down the altars, killed the prophets with the sword, and even I only am left. I'm the only one, God, that you got left on your team. I'm the only one that's on your side. You see, what's happening here is Elijah's lost his perspective. Because his problem is real. Jezebel does want to kill him, and there is a big army that's after him. So it's not that his problem is not true. He has a serious problem. The problem that's even greater, though, is that Elijah has lost perspective. He's lost perspective. And what I mean by that is that he has become a prisoner of the moment. And I encourage you, as we look to the story, to learn from Elijah. Don't become a prisoner of the moment, of that moment of suffering. Because I want to real briefly go through 3 things that he did as a prisoner of the moment. The first thing is this: he exaggerated his problem. He exaggerated his problem. Because did you catch it? He said, all the people have forsaken your covenant. But you remember in chapter 18 that after the fire came down, remember how many in Israel responded? On their faces in worship. He's exaggerating the problem. He said they've thrown down your altars, but you remember what happened in chapter 18? God rebuilt an altar so that he could offer a sacrifice. He said that they've killed all the prophets, but you remember from chapter 18 what we learned? There's at least 100 prophets who are alive that he knew about, that Obadiah had been hiding. He says, I am the only one left. But if you just read further down in chapter 19, what God's going to say is he has 7,000 believers. He's going to have a remnant that's right there with him. You see, Elijah's judgment has been clouded. He's exaggerating his problem because of the pain that he's feeling in that present moment. And have you ever been there before in your own life? Have you ever said things like, Jonathan, you just wouldn't understand the pressure that I'm under. No one else gets it. You wouldn't get how difficult my marriage is and how much of a mess it is. No one understands it. You would understand the addiction and the pain and the trials and the problems that I'm going through. No one else gets it. And can I just tell you, you're wrong. You're wrong. There are others who get it. And you're exaggerating your problem because you become a prisoner of the moment. In fact, we're told in the book of Hebrews, we're told that Jesus is our sympathetic high priest who is actually able to connect with us in any way because he's been tried and tempted in every way, just like you and I. And here's another part I want you to know. There are actually other people in this church and in this community that have been there too. They've been there. Because what Solomon says is there is nothing new under the sun. But when we get stuck in valleys, what happens is we exaggerate our circumstances. We think we're the only one that gets it. But can I just tell you, God gets it. God gets it. And because God gets it, many of God's people get it as well, and they're there with you. Have you exaggerated your problem? But then secondly, what he does is he forgets the past. Elijah has forgotten the past. That he says this problem is so big, but he's forgetting how God's already solved a lot of other big problems. I just have to think as God's listening to Elijah say these things, that he's probably thinking, do you not remember when I fed you with a raven? When I took a dirty bird and made that bird bring clean food to you? Do you not remember when I gave you water every day when there was no water for anyone else? Do you remember when I provided for you through that widow of Zarephath who had nothing, but I just kept multiplying what she had? He's saying, do you not remember how I protected you even though you were just miles away from Jezebel's hometown for years and she couldn't find you? How do you think that happened? He says, do you remember when you called down for fire and rain and I listened and I sent that down? You see, what happens when we become prisoners of our moment is we forget all of the victories that God has already won. Sometimes that present battle becomes so big that it starts overshadowing all the victories from former years. And my question is, have you found yourself in that place where your battle seems so big right now and you're wondering, how on earth can I get past this? I would encourage you today, look backward. Look to the faithfulness of God. Look to the things God has already done in your life and in the lives of others, and don't become a prisoner of the moment. But then thirdly, what he does as a prisoner of the moment is he does this. He overlooks God's power. And this is the most tragic part. He overlooks God's power. He's scared of Jezebel, and he's talking to the living God. He's saying, you're really scared of that one woman with an army when God has limitless resources. And sometimes we do the same thing when we face problems. We forget how big our God is. I don't care how bad your marriage is. God can heal it. I don't care how bad your relationships are. God can mend them. I don't care how bad your finances are. God can fix it. I don't care how bad your health is. God can heal it. I don't care how bad your stress is. God can give you peace. God can do anything he wants to do, but sometimes we don't give him credit for that. We think, oh, he can't solve that. But what Elijah is going to learn here is that God can fix anything. And if you become a prisoner in your moment to think that somehow God can't fix the problem you're in, if you have reached that moment, I'd encourage you, reconsider. Which is what God's going to lead Elijah to do right here in the text. Go back to the text. Verse 11, and he said, go out, God speaks to him, and stand on the mount before the Lord. And we're told, behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountain and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after an earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a sound of a low whisper. So God listens to Elijah bellyache, and after he's done talking, he says, all right, it's my turn to talk. I've heard you. Now it's my turn. And how does he speak first? He actually speaks first through creation. Because if you caught it, there were three things that happened there. There's this massive storm that picks up, and wind just starts howling. And then we're told the earth starts to shake. And then we're told fire comes down. And all these natural phenomena, these amazing things are happening because God is simply flexing to Elijah. He's saying, you're worried about Jezebel? Let me just remind you who I am. Let me just remind you what I can do. And he demonstrates his power, but did you catch what the text said? His voice was not in it. That's not how he heard from him. How did he hear the voice of God? We're told the sound of a whisper. He speaks through the whisper. Psalm 46, verse 10, be still and know that I am God. You see, sometimes when we're in crisis, we're always looking for God to do a miracle and do something, this supernatural act. But how does God speak into our hearts? It's through a still, small voice. And sometimes we have too much noise around us to hear it. But God speaks into his heart. He communicates to him. And if you need a word from the Lord, I encourage you, get away and be quiet. Open up the word and then let the Holy Spirit open up your heart and be silent before God. And then God speaks in that still small voice. And what does he say to Elijah in verse 15? The Lord said to him, go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be the king of Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi, and you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, and you shall anoint to be the prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000, there was the number in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. So God speaks to him, and he says three things to summarize that. The first thing he tells Elijah to do, if you caught it, was return your way, is what he said. He tells him, you're walking the wrong way. You went south, away from my purposes for your life. He said, return. Which even today, that might be what God's trying to say to you. Return your way. You've been walking the wrong way. Turn around and walk the right way. And then what he tells him is two different things. He says, I'm not done with you, Elijah. Because he gives him an assignment. He says, go anoint a new king of Syria. He says, go anoint a new king for Israel. And go anoint a new prophet named Elisha. And the reason why is he's telling Elijah, I've got plans to fix this problem. He says, all these concerns you have right now, Jezebel, Ahab, the Baal worshipers, God's saying, I've already got a plan that's going to take care of all those issues. He's saying, I've got this. And what was Elijah's response? In verse 19, we're told, so he departed. He heard the message, and then he obeyed in response. Elijah's restored and put back into service, and what Elijah shows us is this final point. God speaks life into us. God always speaks life into us. Notice he did not kick Elijah. He didn't say, I want you to stay here and suffer. No, he said, I want to restore you, Elijah, because I've already got plans for you. I've already got a better plan for your life, so quit going the wrong way, go the right way, and listen to my voice, because I have a plan of how I'm going to address all these problems that are plaguing you. And the same way, God has plans for those valleys that you find yourself in. He already has the solution. He already knows what he's going to do with it, because we're told he works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. God already has the plan. He's just asking for you to keep walking the right way. And God shows Elijah that he's ready to restore him. Have you found yourself in a valley? If so, be reminded of this. God's voice is still speaking. And he's speaking to you now, and what is he trying to tell you? He says, I want to comfort you like Elijah, but I also want to restore you, because I've got plans for your life if you'll learn how to trust God, not just on the mountaintop, but also in the valley.